Welcome to Grief in the Room. In this podcast, we do a deep dive into all things grief, so that when those themes of grief and loss show up in your client's story, you're prepared with the insight, tools, and most importantly, confidence to give them the kind of support they need. Grief in the Room is presented by Martin Ruddis and Trudy Bamford, grief trainers and advocates, and good friends. We bring warmth, humanity and humour to this subject, and we're so glad you're joining our conversation today. Please do subscribe to and say hello to us in the comments.
Before we go into this episode of the podcast, I just wanted to say a few words about what you can expect, because this episode might sound a little bit different to usual, and that is on purpose. So we are recording the first of a 3-part series about neurodivergence and grief, and in this episode we're going to be looking at what the experience of neurodivergence is like, how it affects people, how it impacts people, and especially how it might impact the experience of grief. Now, I am neurodivergent, I am autistic, Martin is neurotypical, and as well as talking about the topic, one of the things we wanted to capture in this episode is what that experience is like for somebody neurodivergent, perhaps struggling to communicate about something quite difficult, and how that is received by somebody neurotypical. So normally when we are editing these episodes, we will edit out the pauses and the filler words and the bits where we lose our train of thought, and we try to let them have a good flow for you. We haven't really done that with this episode, and that is deliberate because we wanted you to hear in real time what it is like for somebody neurodivergent to maybe be struggling to communicate their thoughts, to find the right words for how they're feeling or what's on their mind. And so you are going to hear me hesitating, pausing for quite a long time, losing my train of thought. And you are going to hear Martin giving me the space to do that and checking out carefully with me that he is understanding what I'm saying. I found this episode quite difficult to record because it is so close to home. And so I did struggle, and we wanted that to come through in the recording so that you're getting a really kind of raw, authentic, bird's eye view of what it can be like for somebody neurodivergent who at other times might not struggle to communicate, might sound very eloquent and not struggle for words. But when it's something that is close to home and that maybe they feel uncomfortable or find it difficult to talk about, then their communication can start to be impacted. So keep that in mind as you listen. As I said, this is the first of a 3-part series that we're doing, and we hope that you enjoy it.
So, Trudy, today's topic is going to be about neurodiversity and neurodivergence. I always get confused about that. What's the right terminology for starters?
Okay, so neurodiversity means everybody.
Right.
Everybody's neurodiverse, but then that breaks into 2 groups, the neurodivergent and the neurotypical.
Right.
So neurodiversity acknowledges the fact that every brain is different.
There is diversity.
Yes.
And it makes perfect sense when you say it like that. Because over the last couple of weeks, I've been training police and also rail, and everybody's saying, oh yeah, we've got a real focus on neurodiversity. I'm not sure what that looks like. And I know we've had a lot of conversations about neurodiversity and neurospiciness and all that. And I know we want to do some work, and we're starting on that now. And I know that when you did your presentation for neurodiversity in the Summer of Learning, that seems like a year ago now, for Crew's bereavement support, it was received so well. The bookings, it was the high bookings for the Summer of Learning events and seminars. And, I think there was one person in there that was within NHS said, my whole team need this, which is why we're doing this podcast as well, because I'm becoming very increasingly aware, because of the relationship with you as well, that my approach to my work and this work is different. I learn so much every time I listen to you do that presentation. And that's why we're going to lean into it more. So where would you like to start?
So I think just picking up on what you've just said, really, that there is this incredible need for better understanding around neurodivergence in general, and that is beginning to grow, which is lovely. But people that work with grief, like our listeners, they are starting to recognise that the experience of grief is different for somebody neurotypical and somebody neurodivergent, just as the experience of life is different for, everybody across that neurodiverse spectrum.
Yeah.
And it is really important to understand that if you are supporting somebody, because we know that it is thought that about 15 to 20% of the population are neurodivergent. So that will include people who are autistic, people who've got ADHD, Tourette syndrome, dyslexia, dyspraxia, there's a few others. Those are the ones that have been diagnosed. And a lot of people, and myself included, are late diagnosed. So that number may well be significantly higher than that. And what happens is, and I'm going to go into this in a moment, that in order to fit in to a world that has been designed for neurotypical people, in order to fit in, to get approval, to be accepted, to be able to function, neurodivergent people learn to mask.
Yeah.
And they don't even know that they're doing it a lot of the time. You don't realise you're masking until you learn that you're neurodivergent, and then you learn what masking is. But that mask will slip at times of stress and strain and distress, and we know that there is probably no harder time than when somebody dies and you're dealing with all of the grief, all of the bereavement, all of the arrangements, all of it, everything.
Is there an event or a trigger or a stage in life that would trigger someone to actually get a diagnosis? So, for example, I know menopause can amplify symptoms, and where someone's had coping mechanisms that have been managing these symptoms throughout their life, when they hit certain stages in life, like menopause or change of career, job, or illness, or some form of other change, like grief, where our coping mechanisms are weakened as well, does that mean that could trigger and activate a diagnosis or a pathway to a diagnosis?
Yeah, I think there's a few kind of triggers. A very, very common one will be you're a parent and your child gets diagnosed. And as you're going through that diagnosis process with them, you recognise, oh, that's my experience too. So a lot of people are kind of diagnosed in their 30s and 40s for that very reason. Yeah. And also, it is being spoken about now more. If I think back to when I was younger, the only visualisation of autism was Rain Man.
Yes.
And I think ADHD was only ever talked about in terms of naughty children.
Yes.
But as time has passed and we've learned a bit more and society has started to try to understand things a bit more, that sort of extremely polarised, I'm not sure that's the right word, but that very kind of narrow view of what somebody might present like is starting to shift. And so people are recognising in themselves more and more, hang on, I don't seem to function like other people do. I always thought that was because something was wrong with me or I wasn't trying hard enough. But actually, this really resonates. Maybe that could be a reason why. Then they start to look into it, and then all the dots join up.
So you mentioned earlier on that it's thought that 15 to 20% of the population are neurodivergent. And I know you've said this, and I've heard you say this so many times. It is not a disorder. It's simply that someone else is navigating the world differently. Their brains are navigating the world differently than everyone else. Or can you even say that, everyone else? We all navigate the world individually anyway.
Yeah, but I think the phrase that I use is different, not less.
Okay.
Because especially if you weren't diagnosed as a child and you have been struggling to function throughout your life, you do feel very much less. You do feel like something is very much wrong with you. But in reality, it's just that the world is not set up for you. The world is set up for neurotypical people.
Yeah. But you can be made to feel like you don't fit in.
Absolutely.
It's like the world's not made for tall people either, in truth. You know, it's especially if you go on trains and things like that, or planes, or larger people. It's set up for an average of person. And I don't know what even an average of person is. Okay. So it's not less. It's not always more either, is it?
No, and this is one of my little bugbears, is when people say,
just one,
particularly say it about autism, it's a superpower.
Yeah.
I don't like that. Unless you're saying it about yourself, that's okay. I don't mind if you say it about yourself, but it's simply different. It's as simple as that. And you know, we are going to be talking about this in broad terms, because we have to talk about it in broad terms.
Sure.
We wouldn't be able to talk about it, but it's really important at the outset to say that we will be trying not to generalize, and everybody's experience is different. And you know, if you've met one person with ADHD, that doesn't mean you've met everybody with ADHD. You know, everybody is different, and everyone's experience of their neurodivergence will be different. But there are broad similarities that we can learn about that can help us to understand a little bit more.
Whilst we're talking in broader terms, and we don't want to paint a brush, and as you've said many times, if you've met one neurodivergent person, you've met one neurodivergent person. And I get that now. Give me an example from you. So where we've been working together, and because you can become so hyper focused, and you can you know, you won't task switch and things like that. So
I would kindly push back on the won't. It's not won't task switch.
Can't.
Or can't without a level of distress.
Talk to me about that. So, and this is part of how we've had to learn to work together as well, because you've had to educate me. You know, the way I communicate is very different to the way you communicate, and I can send you an email, or we'll have a conversation, and you will take elements of that, but not other elements of that. And I miss that sometimes, so I've had to learn. And in the early days, did I see it as can't? I have to say I probably did see it as can't, or won't. Don't know what I'm trying to say. I didn't see it from the way you were experiencing it. I can say that.
So the way that I sort of try to explain it to people is, if you're neurotypical, you're seeing the full big picture. And that's good. You welcome that. You like to be able to see the full picture. If you are, or for a lot of people who are neurodivergent, it's like looking at the world through a little toilet roll tube. You're only seeing a small area, but you are intensely focused on that, because it's such a small area. So once you are in that focus, it takes a lot of mental energy to get out of that focus and switch to something else.
And so it takes a lot of mental energy. And then if you switch, it's not an easy switch for you either, is it? It takes a lot of energy, but also I know that you do not like, don't want to use the word hate, you do not like leaving something partially unfinished, or you don't
hate it.
So So even again, it's not just the fact that you can't do it, because you could do it, but if you did do it, it's going to cost you so much. But also, you're going to hate the fact that you've been made to do it.
There's a sort of emotional response that is linked to the task that you are focused on.
Right.
It's hard to explain.
Well, I think you're doing a great job.
It's an investment. You're invested. You're invested in whatever it is that you are focused on. And to be pulled away from that investment, it's difficult. And then it might take you a little bit of time to get into the next thing that you've been asked to do. And if you're somebody maybe that works in an office, I went and worked in an office for a while in an admin role, and I was constantly being pulled away from one thing to do something else, and it was unbearable. And if anybody's not diagnosed, go and work in an office environment. You'll soon know if you're neurodivergent or not.
And I was about to say, I was about to bring an exact example in. I mean, I know the example you're talking about, because we were trying to do other things at the same time as well, and you were spinning too many plates, and it was costing you so much.
And it makes you feel absolutely awful about yourself, because, the example that I've just given, I can see myself in the office now, and the demands upon me were not, by any stretch of the imagination, unreasonable.
Or beyond your capability.
Or beyond my capabilities. But the response that it was bringing up in me felt so extreme that is incredibly distressing. And then you get back into the loop of, what on earth is wrong with me? Why can't I manage what everybody around me in this office is perfectly well managing?
Mm-hmm. It's a similar thing with training as well, because I know you can train, deliver training. So within our relationship, we've got a division of labour, because that's what we do. We all outsource things in partnerships, and you're very much the creative side of things, far better at it than me, and you bring that focus down that, I hate to say toilet roll, telescopic focus to something. So I know you can scan something and check it instantaneously for spellings, typos, fonts, and inference and common sense. You can do that. Just, it's a gift. And also you've got the visual of the artist as well, which is great. And I know you can articulate and you can talk and present, because you do it, but the cost is too much for you. It costs too much to manage to juggle all the plates of technology. If something goes wrong, if someone asks you a question, let alone keeping the story and the thread alive. It's not that you can't do it, but is it worth paying the cost to do it? Is that right? Is that a good interpretation of?
Yeah, I think it would probably make sense to maybe explain a little bit about executive function.
Cool.
Because all of these kind of things that we're talking about are all under the control of executive function, which is like the CEO of the brain, and it's running everything. It's running all the tasks. It's running all of the demands upon it. That is one of the common features across the different kinds of neurodivergence, is that it is all about executive function. So I think I heard somebody explain the difference between neurotypical and neurodivergent once as the difference between using the Windows platform and using the Mac platform. They both work beautifully well. They've both got their own strengths, but they are a different operating system. And when you're neurodivergent, all of these executive functioning tasks, so that is the way that you process sensory information, the sounds, the sights, the smells, the touch, the way that you process emotion, the way that you are able to focus your attention, the way that you think, the way that you reason, your memory, your motivation, the way that you interact with other people, the way that you plan, the way that you organise. These are all under control of your executive function in your brain. And you mentioned plate spinning. That is basically what that's like. And somebody who's neurotypical will be spinning more of those plates faster without a significant impact on them than somebody who's neurodivergent. If you're neurodivergent, it's like a pool of resources. And if your resources are all taken up with one aspect of that, so for example, you're processing some intense emotions, it is going to have a knock-on effect to the other executive functioning tasks. So you might find it much harder to make decisions, or you might find you're forgetting things more. And this is really relevant in terms of grief, because when somebody's processing grief, they're processing really intense emotions. And we know that that's got a knock-on effect on everything for everybody, but it is going to have a more significant knock-on effect for somebody who's neurodivergent, because their pool of resources, it's not that it's smaller, but it's more focused, and it will run out faster and it will take longer to refill.
So Trudy, in all the work that I do and that we put together as well when we're explaining grief, my favourite approach now is to, let's talk about grief. And everyone thinks they know what grief is. So then I reframe grief and we look at what grief really truly is, how we can all have a grief reaction when that connection, that bond is broken. Then using the powerful work of Mary Frances O'Connor, and I notice that you have the grieving body behind you now as well, which is truly exciting. Using the insights and knowledge that Mary Frances O'Connor gave us with the grieving brain, again, we broaden that picture of what grief is, and then we look at actually what impact does it have on our cognitive, emotional, physical and behavioural side, because grief will have an impact on everything, all those aspects. Can we just walk around the cognitive, and we walk around those four elements, and you can explain to me how it might be perceived or seen as different for someone that is neurodivergent?
Where do you want to start?
Tell me about cognitions.
So this kind of circles back to what I was saying about executive function, really, because there is a difference in. No, let me say that again. One of the ways that I describe being neurodivergent, it's like being in a room with 10 radio stations all playing at the same time, and they're all playing something different, and you cannot turn any of them off.
Wow.
Because it feels like, particularly at times of stress, it feels like an onslaught of information coming into your brain, and you don't really have the ability to filter or to control that. So as you can imagine, that does have an impact on the way that people are able to process thoughts. And we know that cognition is already significantly impacted after a loss because of what is going on inside our brains. But for somebody who's neurodivergent, the way that might sort of play out, it could be two extremes. They could get completely fixated on what has happened, on the details, on wanting to talk about it to the exclusion of everything else. Or the opposite, they could be putting all of their efforts into avoidance and avoiding thinking about it and avoiding facing the reality of it and avoiding wanting to talk about it. And in both cases, that is their brain's way of trying to manage this onslaught of thoughts and emotions and, you know, all the rest of it that we're going to talk about. So you might find that somebody gets very, very preoccupied with the details of a death, particularly if it was sudden and shocking.
Yeah.
Or they might not be able to properly process what has happened and keep asking the same question over and over again. We often find this in therapy when we're supporting people, that they keep asking the same question over and over again, and that's because there's a difficulty in processing the information and the facts. And for a lot of people, particularly if they are autistic, this is certainly the case for me, the default is to take things that are said literally. Now, I know to run things through a processor. A lot of people don't actually, and they will answer the question literally. I know to run it through a processor, so I haven't told you this, But every time you say to me, what have you got on today? My instinct is to say, I've got on a hoodie. But I run that through my processor and I know that you're saying, what's on your schedule today?
And so that processor, again, must consume energy.
It does, and it's also a little bit annoying. It is a little. I'm like, why? Why do you want to answer that literally? But that's just the way that the question requires a literal answer. Somebody dies, and people go into the social cues and the social behaviour, and how you're feeling, but they don't really want to know how you're feeling. Well, for somebody neurodivergent, they may really answer that question.
Because again, as well, they may really answer that question, and also they may or may not have the ability to pick up on the social cues of the person and the situation and the sensitivity. I've seen this myself.
And we know that behaviour does change around the time of a death. So people do act a little bit differently for a while.
Sure.
And when you're neurodivergent, one of the things that you learn to do, and you learn to do it really early, is to model your behaviour on the people around you. That is all part of masking. You watch the neurotypical people, you see what is expected, and you copy it. But when people are behaving differently, that's incredibly unsettling, because you don't know what to do then. And it feels like everybody else has been given this handbook at birth as to how to respond in all these different situations, but you weren't given the handbook. Then you're constantly just scrambling, trying to figure out what is appropriate, what is expected, and at the same time balance that with what you need.
Sure.
And what happens is the sacrifice gets made for what you need. That's the price that gets paid for doing what is expected and what will be acceptable.
Okay. So we've touched on cognitions and behaviour a little. And I recognise that we could spend all day going into all of these. Literally, we're going to do a couple of parts to this podcast to explain more. And as we build the course that we're going to run as well, based around neurodivergent and particular grief, we'll go into even more detail then. What about physically, Trudy?
So there's something that probably a lot of listeners will be familiar with called interoception, which is the way that your brain relays your physical messages. And for a lot of people who are neurodivergent, there can be a disconnect. So somebody might not notice that they haven't drunk anything all day, unless the people around them point it out. And a lot of people who are neurodivergent, they struggle to look after themselves. They struggle with self-care at the best of times, because it feels really overwhelming for some people. So that already is impacted after a bereavement, isn't it? People find it difficult to look after themselves because they're in a lot of distress. So if you already struggled with that before, that could be impacted.
Okay, well, that was a great insight. That was a great insight. And we know, again, I mean, just literally in grief, our immune systems are weakened. We can become more susceptible to illness, and we're struggling as we're just processing everything, the overwhelming emotions that happen. So, I mean, just moving around the map, in terms of emotions, I think you've touched on a lot of that. Is there anything you want to say about if we broke this down into a slide with the emotion on it? Is there anything you'd like to say particularly about the emotional response for a neurodivergent?
I think that one of the really important ones to understand is what's known as scrambling.
Yeah.
So this is when somebody shows the opposite emotion to what they're feeling. So instead of crying, they laugh. And it is actually a way of self-regulation.
Okay.
But it can come across as callous and cold and unfeeling and confusing.
Yeah.
But it is something that is common to people who are neurodivergent, that especially if they don't have perhaps that emotional intelligence to even be able to identify what they're feeling. A lot of people who are neurodivergent can't even identify the feelings.
Wow. Okay.
If you ask them how they're feeling, they don't know, because there's that disconnect. So scrambling is more common in those sort of circumstances, and that's, if we're supporting somebody, that's certainly something that we may see. And emotional regulation, that is a huge one. That's such an important one to talk about. Any kind of regulation can be more challenging for people who are neurodivergent. Emotional regulation is very, very difficult. So emotions are experienced really intensely or not at all because they are too intense. And when you have this onslaught of emotions that come after grief, that can either shut people down. So again, they're going to come across as being cold or callous or numb because it's too much, because you're feeling too much, or they will be having meltdowns and shutdowns and showing extreme emotions, because it's like all the volume is turned up to the maximum, to the point where you've got screaming feedback.
Right. We're painting a picture. I'm very aware we're painting a picture that it's really, 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 really hard. The grieving process for someone that's neurodivergent is really hard. Are there any aspects that could be perceived, and again, it's all individual, I get that would make it easier for someone to process their grief, which is a healthy, natural process, and it's really important to grieve. I'm not going to use the word superpower because that's not the word we were using here. But is there any aspect of being neurodivergent, could it be perceived as being helpful when someone's deep in their grief?
That's actually an incredibly interesting question, and I hadn't thought about it until this moment.
You hadn't thought about something I have first?
Yeah.
Wow. Can we listen to the audience? We're recording this, and I'm glad it's been recorded, even though it may not make the episode because Trudy is in charge of the editing, but we've got it on record, and I will record a snip of this just for my own self-gratification. So, far away.
The reason it's interesting is because I think it's really easy to focus on the challenges and the downside. But actually, if you are neurodivergent, you will have learned some skills to manage. I mean, those skills are going to be perhaps on a sliding scale, depending on how much work you've done, how much support you've had. But you will have learned some skills, and those skills have allowed you to function and to get to where you are. And yes, those skills absolutely could be channeled into processing grief and starting that rebuilding process. So just thinking of a couple perhaps, and I don't know, this first one perhaps doesn't sound like a skill, but nevertheless I'm going to mention it. A lot of neurodivergent people do something called stimming, which is a self-soothing behaviour. So it'll be something repetitive. It could be tapping or rocking or humming, and it is something that is designed to self-soothe your nervous system and to re-regulate yourself. And we might find that if we're supporting somebody who's grieving, we might start to see them stim that we haven't seen before, or they might be doing it more intensely or more frequently. And that is actually a really good thing, because they are instinctively soothing their nervous system.
Right.
And another one, that hyper focus that I think
Yes.
we've mentioned already, that monotropic attention that can hyper focus on something, that can be both a blessing and a curse. If it is focused on the distress and that rumination that we've spoken about in a previous episode, that can be very difficult to get that needle off the stuck record. But if it is channeled with support into the special interest that perhaps that person is really passionate about or finds comfort or joy in, that can be then an incredibly valuable tool to help them to, again, regulate and to find some stability and comfort and an anchor point around which that they can start to rebuild again.
Okay.
Is there anything else?
Well, as you've just been talking, I will say this. I've got kind of broad permission to say this as well. We will include the outro music of this. Will include a piano piece that was written by a family friend's son who held his brother as he died by his own hand, and he has manifested his grief, and he is, I'm not going to attach any labels here, but he's incredibly highly functioning, and he made this beautiful piano piece 3 days after holding his brother as he died, and it's huge. And I know from that journey, from just a couple of weeks ago, from this recording, that has manifested into some huge amounts of support and processing for him, but not just him, his parents, obviously the mum and dad of his brother, and that's massive. And as you were saying that, it came to me, his musical talent, and I've known this over the years, has come to the fore when he experiences severe emotion, and it has done now with the death of his brother. So, yeah, and I would see that as a huge channel for him to process his grief. Yeah.
And we know so well that everybody processes grief differently. I think we're more familiar, though, with the processing of grief amongst neurotypical people, and we're more familiar with it because that's what's generally portrayed.
I would agree, and again, in the lessons that when we teach about, when we do our psychoeducation about grief, and I get to, for example, the behavioural aspects, and I will quite happily lead into this one by saying, and the behavioural one, we can identify with all this list of behaviours that we can see where someone's obviously in their grief or not, because there is no typical behaviour for grief. But you're right, there's a bunch of griefy behaviours that we attach to our behaviours, crying and yearning and all that kind of behaviour. But not everyone does it. Not everyone neurotypical. Not everyone neurodivergent. Not everybody. It's not a. What do I say? It's not a prescription, is it? At all. You don't have to. Okay.
But the reason that I said that is because if we're supporting somebody who's neurodivergent and they're grieving, we may see their responses or their behaviours as being problematic. And we may feel that it's important for us to help them to do it a different way.
And they don't need help to do it a different way.
That's why this topic is so important, because they will have been told, either overtly or covertly, throughout their life, that the way that they're responding is wrong, and the way that they're thinking is wrong, and the way that they're behaving is wrong.
And the therapist will be told in college or school, this is the approach that you take. And in college and school, we don't get told. We don't get taught, told, or informed. We don't get these coping mechanisms to approach things differently for neurodivergent people. So that's interesting, because you were just moving into, that was almost like therapist double empathy trap.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there is this kind of, see, I'm actually struggling to articulate, and I don't normally do that when we record our podcast, but because it's because I'm talking about my own experience and it's so close to home that the listeners can probably tell that I am struggling to find the words. I'm working a lot harder than I normally do.
And I can see you working a lot harder, and I can see that, but our listeners, I don't think, will pick up that and perceive that. But I think it's good for you to lean into that and put it out there.
I can't remember why I started that sentence. What was the start of the sentence?
Without...
Where was I going? Because I want to say what I was going to say. You said about double empathy.
Double empathy for therapists and double empathy for, you know, the approach that a therapist would take when approaching someone with neurodiversity and experiencing grief.
No, it's completely gone.
Okay. So stop, pause.
Oh, okay. No, it's back. And we're just talking. No, I'm going to say that. It can be unbelievably difficult. I can't even put into words how difficult for somebody neurodivergent to be able to express how they're feeling. It can be so, so difficult. Or to be able to express it in the right words so that it's clear. So of course, if we're supporting somebody, we might not know how they're feeling or how much they're struggling because it's so difficult to put words to the confusion of what you're trying to figure out in real time and process at the same time.
It's a lot. He says, bring it back to Pooh Bear language. It's a lot. Talk to me about double empathy trap.
So the double empathy trap is, there was this misconception that, particularly with autism actually, that you couldn't be empathic if you were neurodivergent, if you were autistic.
Okay.
But what research eventually showed was it's not a question of not having empathy. It's this difficulty in communication. So the neurotypical person sees the neurodivergent person as lacking empathy, and the neurodivergent person sees the neurotypical person as lacking empathy. It's simply a lack of communication because they are almost talking different languages.
Layers upon layers of challenges.
Yeah, but I think what I also want to say is that it's not consistent. The struggle is not consistent.
Okay.
It's not 24/7, 365 days a year.
Sure.
It's not predictable like that.
Okay.
It is all linked up to the amount of distress that the person is in or the amount of stress that the person is under. When things are stable and running well, it's like it dials down, which I think can be actually really quite unsettling for neurotypical people.
Sure.
Because from one day to the next, that person may need significantly less or more support, whereas I don't know. I'm struggling a bit here because I feel like I'm talking about neurotypical people and I don't actually know what that experience is like.
But I suppose then the neurotypical people, because we all have our inner fix-it monster, and if we're used to supporting someone that's acting in a certain way, and then all of a sudden they don't need that from you, that can be very frustrating for someone that's used to providing that infrastructure, that support, that mechanism. You know, even if they're not trying to fix someone's grief, which we know you can't do, they're trying to fix things around that grief. And then all of a sudden, if you withdraw from that and you don't need it anymore, it will it will give the supporter a sense of, oh, they don't need me anymore, or, or it will cause a reaction within them. I'm channeling my inner Megan Devine now, the bunny and the bear, because why aren't you accepting my ability to hold you, fix you, and make you happy again, and take you away from the pain that you're in? So, yeah, I think that was an important point you just made. So, Trudy, we've talked a lot about, I hate to use this word, but challenges, and there are some significant challenges and different ways of looking at this. Unless I've had the benefit of a very close working relationship with you, and you've taught me all about a lot of these things, I still would not feel 100% confident or comfortable in delivering a course based around grief and best practice for working with neurodivergent people. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm getting there because my depth of knowledge is increasing, but I still feel that you would be the better person to present a course like this. So can we do part 2 of this podcast where you can give us some best practice for therapists and counsellors in the room and explain and relate neurodivergence to some of the models? Would that be okay for part 2?
Yeah, I think what we've done today is sort of paint a broad picture of neurodivergence and touched on how that might come out in grief. But what I would also like to do is to look at some of the models of grief that we're familiar with and how there might be a slight nuance, slight difference for somebody who's neurodivergent. And then, yes, we will look at, if you are supporting somebody, what is the best practice? What do they need? What do you need to keep in mind so that people are more equipped? Because this kind of support is desperately needed. And more understanding is desperately needed. Because all of these challenges are only difficult challenges where there is no understanding.
Yeah, I think that's the way we approach our grief work as well, where there's a lack of understanding and knowledge, which is why we do a lot of psychological education. There's fear, and where there's fear, there's anxiety, in my mind. So good. Let's get back on the schedule. A slight little plug: we are creating something new called the Grief Guides, and so our resource and focus is on that a lot. And as you've heard, that Trudy is very focused on certain things, so we have to jump and skip at an appropriate time, which is why now we've recorded the pod today, and we will do part 2 of this within the next 2 weeks. Thank you for joining our conversation today. This episode of Grief in the Room was presented by Martin Rodis and Trudy Bamford.